تنسوا الإعجاب بالفيديو والاشتراك في القناة.
Which means they fit a genre that aimed to preserve historical facts about a person. The Gospel authors were also quite conservative compared to other writers in how they followed their own sources. They didn't create drastic literary changes. We also surveyed the external data and found that we have unanimous agreement from church fathers that the Gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There is no indication they were ever thought of as anonymous biographies. Then we demonstrated it would not have been difficult for the disciples to have reliable memories of Jesus' words and deeds for several decades after the resurrection. The culture of the time also fostered the development of strong memory, and within the Gospels, we see evidence of a reliable oral tradition that has a rhythmic nature, easy to retain for a long period of time. We also demonstrated evidence within Paul's letters there is a gospel tradition that was already in existence and coheres to the same teachings we find in our 4 canonical gospels. The evidence also indicates the synoptic gospels date to the late 50s and early 60s. And finally, the evidence shows Jesus often taught in Greek, which means many of his original Greek sayings are preserved in the gospels. With this as our foundation, we have good evidence the Gospels are reliable accounts that go back to the historical Jesus. But as we noted, the unanimous attestation from the early church is that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark, an interpreter and follower of Peter. The Gospel is never attributed to anyone else. All agree the author is Mark, who was writing down the teachings of Peter. Even Justin Martyr, who had no need to name the Gospel authors, appears to agree the Gospel of Mark goes back to Peter. He said it is recorded in the memoirs of Peter that Jesus changed the names of the sons of Zebedee to the sons of thunder. This event is only recorded in Mark. Justin also said the Gospels were the memoirs of the apostles, and as Craig Evans says, the important point here is that memoirs are not anonymous, they are linked to known personalities. Beyond this, Irenaeus said Mark, the disciple and recorder of Peter, has also handed on to us in writing what had been proclaimed by Peter. Tertullian tells us Mark was the interpreter of Peter. The anti-Marcionite prologue records that Mark's gospel came from Mark, the interpreter of Peter. Clement of Alexandria said Mark was a follower of Peter, who wrote down what he preached. Origen said the second gospel was that according to Mark, who wrote it according to Peter's instructions. Papias recorded that Mark was a follower and interpreter of Peter, who wrote down what Peter preached, and that Peter often accommodated his teachings to whom he was preaching to. This suggested Mark heard Peter preach often and in different ways. Additionally, the first epistle of Peter says someone named Mark was present with him. So the evidence puts Mark and Peter together. The external evidence all points to Peter being the eyewitness source behind the Gospel of Mark. And we can also point out that Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source, but they made very little changes to Mark's narrative when compared to the types of changes other ancient biographers made to their own sources. The evidence reveals Matthew and Luke had a greater reverence for Mark than what even Josephus had for the Hebrew Scriptures. This would support the notion the Gospel was considered authoritative, given how little was changed by the standards of the ancient time, and this would support the notion it came from Peter. Despite this, skeptics still deny that the Gospel goes back to Peter and Mark. But when we look at internal evidence, it actually confirms the tradition that the Gospel does go back to Peter, an eyewitness of Jesus. Within the Gospel of Mark, we find an interesting phenomenon. The Greek is sometimes worded strangely. This language is cleaned up by both Luke and Matthew. Some have argued this indicates Mark was a clumsy author, but this is unlikely because Maurice Casey has pointed out when we recreate Aramaic versions, the language of Mark makes more sense. What we find is Mark was translating many literal Aramaic sayings of Jesus into Greek, which explains why his Greek is worded as it is. Casey says, passages such as Mark 1:39-43 and 11:15-17 show a large amount of parataxis and verbs placed near the beginnings of sentences. While both these phenomena occur in crude and are Semitizing Greek, in true stories about events in Aramaic-speaking communities, they are more likely to be due to the translation of Aramaic sources. What this indicates is there are Aramaic originals to some of the sayings in Mark's Gospel. Mark was not writing Greek fiction, but working with Aramaic speakers or sources to pass on what Jesus said and did. As Casey said, all this would be to no avail if Mark's Gospel were really Greek fiction, or if all of it had been so heavily edited that Aramaic sources were irrecoverable. We have found substantial and decisive evidence that parts of Mark's Gospel are literal translations of written Aramaic sources. The fact that Mark used Aramaic sources makes no sense on the hypothesis he was creating a fictional account in Greek. But it is expected, if the church tradition about the origin of Mark is correct, that he was relying on Peter, who spoke Aramaic and would have heard Jesus teach in Aramaic. Casey also points out that some of the passages that have Aramaic originals reflect the concerns of Jews about the details of the law. This indicates Mark preserved early traditions that go back to a rabbi in Judea and Galilee who was dealing with Pharisaic disputes, and not traditions that reflect the later concerns of Gentile Christians. Thus, due to the Jewish nature of these passages, and that they are Aramaic translations, Casey argues Mark's source was very early, dating to before 40 AD, and came from a Jew from Israel. In fact, Casey even suggests Mark's source had to come from an eyewitness, and specifically, one of the 12 disciples, since Mark's Aramaic source records things that only the 12 were present for. And given the church tradition about Mark, the most likely candidate is Peter himself. Casey suggests Mark was getting his information from a written source composed by a member of the 12, but a more likely explanation is presented by Craig Evans. He points out in the ancient world, authors relied heavily on notes that they took before composing a final orderly account. Both Galen and Lucian spoke of the need to take notes when interviewing eyewitnesses. Given the cultural context, Mark likely would have written notes before writing his gospel. And if Mark was the interpreter of Peter, who often heard Peter preaching about Jesus, it is likely he took Aramaic notes that he later used to compose his Greek gospel. Given the evidence Casey lays out, a likely explanation is Mark was drawing from his own notes that he wrote while hearing Peter preach. Either way, the evidence still points to the fact that Mark was getting his information from an eyewitness of Jesus. James Crossley strengthens this by pointing out Mark preserves accurate Jewish customs. In Mark 6:56, we are told Jesus had a fringe of his garment, which is consistent with the biblical command for men to wear tassels on their clothing. He also upheld the biblical law of appearing before a priest and going out to dwell in the wilderness when people began to find out he touched a leper. Mark 2:23-28, which Casey identifies as originally in Aramaic, presents a dispute between Jesus and the Pharisees on plucking heads of grain on the Sabbath. Casey notes the dispute recorded in Mark 2:23-24 is very intra-Jewish. We see rabbis in Jewish texts dispute over what was lawful to do to obtain food on the Sabbath. In this story, Jesus does not contradict the Torah, but rebukes the Pharisees' strict interpretation of it. The issue of what was lawful on the Sabbath would not have been a controversy for the church when it was predominantly populated with Gentiles. It would have been an issue for the early Jewish followers of Jesus. Casey says, Mark 2:23-28 is very Jewish and unlike anything known from the early church. Thus, it is possible that this is a passage that accurately reports an event from the ministry of the historical Jesus. Mark 7 refers to the Pharisees' washing rituals, which included the washing of cups, pots, copper vessels, and dining couches. These practices are seen in Jewish legal texts, which discuss the details about washing dishes and other vessels. This suggests Mark had access to intricate knowledge of Jewish legal thought. Moreover, the chapter focuses on an issue regarding clean and unclean foods in Jewish law. Crossley notes this reflects the worries of early Jewish Christians and accurately portrays the Jewish custom around purity laws. It should therefore be accepted that the Mark in Jesus stands in the Jewish tradition of those dedicated to God and the Torah in his stance on the family. Peter J. Williams notes Mark records a whole group of tax collectors was in Capernaum. This would be expected if one knew the area, as Capernaum was situated at a strategic point on the northern end of the Sea of Galilee, and an important location for collecting taxes, on what crossed the border of Herod Antipas's territory. This is a minor detail, but a detail one would expect to find if Mark was working with eyewitnesses. Mark also records crowds were saying Hosanna in the highest. In the Psalms, Hosanna means save, but in later times the meaning of the word shifted to express celebration. Williams says, this shift of meaning of Hosanna shows up in later Jewish sources. Thus, the writers show knowledge not only of this word's use by Jews at a particular time, but also of its development over time. Additionally, the word has a different form from that of the original Hebrew. The omission of the I sound represents a linguistic change over time, reflecting the Hebrew at the time of the New Testament, not when the psalm was written. The Gospel writers have the word exactly as it was pronounced in the first century, even though this is not the sort of knowledge any author could obtain simply by consulting books. Greg Boyd also notes that Mark accurately describes the political landscape of the religious community in the region. In Mark, the scribes are a distinct group from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they come up to Galilee from Jerusalem, which is accurate in terms of group distinctions and where the scribes were headquartered, as the scribes were seen as a separate class in the religious divisions. The title the scribe of the Pharisees is portrayed as someone who was an intellectual leader of the Pharisees, and Mark also suggests the Sadducees are absent in Galilee, which corresponds to what we know about the time and region. Mark also differentiates between elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law. But these distinctions ceased to exist after 70 AD. As Martin Hangel notes, after 70, this whole pluralistic political and religious landscape, which Mark depicts quite accurately in broad outline, was destroyed. Boyd notes that because Mark gets all these distinctions and details right, this suggests an AD pre-70 dating is more reasonable than an AD post-70 dating, and it shows Mark has accurate knowledge of the religious landscape of the region. So not only does Mark contain Aramaic translations of episodes that likely came from a member of the 12, he had intimate knowledge of Jewish customs, which supports the tradition that Mark was hearing from Peter, the Jewish eyewitness of Jesus, who would have been familiar with these customs. Another interesting aspect of Mark is highlighted by Gerd Thiessen. In the Gospels we see many names, but when we get to the Passion narrative in the Synoptics, many of the individuals surrounding Jesus' arrest and trial are left unnamed. Thiessen notes this is odd and can make the narrative a bit confusing. For example, we do not know if the man who cut off the ear and the one who fled naked were disciples of Jesus or not. Thiessen's point is that it seems to me that the narrative motive for this anonymity is not hard to guess, for both of them had run afoul of the police. Both these people were in danger in the aftermath, as long as the high priest's slave was alive, and as long as the scar from the sword cut was visible. It would have been inopportune to mention names. It would not have been wise to identify them as members of the early Christian community. Their anonymity is for their protection, and the obscurity of their positive relationship with Jesus is a strategy of caution. Both the teller and the hearers know more about these two people. What is interesting is by the time John was written, we are told it was Peter who cut off the soldier's ear. Richard Bauckham notes other figures are also left anonymous who helped with Jesus' triumphant entry and could have been considered co-conspirators in attempting to make Jesus king. Bauckham notes the story of Lazarus may have been left out of the Synoptics for his protection as well. And again, if these people come into the story of John's Gospel, they are named with ease. Thiessen suggests this means the Passion narrative that wound up in the Synoptic Gospel. They are named with ease. Thiessen suggests this means the Passion narrative that wound up in the Synoptic Gospels was formulated early on, when the church still needed to protect those close to Jesus' mission. There is no literary reason for many of these people to be left unnamed, given how central they are to the story, and we find that John, who wrote much later, had no issue telling us their names. Richard Bauckham says, Mark's apparent strategy of leaving it for them to perceive, rather than highlighting it himself, coheres rather strikingly with the strategy of protective anonymity in relation to certain characters in this narrative. What put these persons in danger in Jerusalem in the period of the earliest Christian community would be their complicity in Jesus' alleged seditious behavior in the days before his arrest. Gerd Thiessen adds, Only in Jerusalem was there reason to draw a cloak of anonymity over followers of Jesus who had endangered themselves by their actions. The date could also be pinpointed. Parts of the Passion account would have to have been composed within the generation of the eyewitnesses and their contemporaries, that is, somewhere between 30 and 60 AD. This indicates Mark preserves early traditions that would have been formulated by the first Christians in Jerusalem, and strengthens the case his information came from eyewitnesses who had a motive to protect those close to Jesus.
لا تنسوا الإعجاب بالفيديو والاشتراك في القناة.